And number three.
Number three.
Number three.
Magic number. This is your host, Chimp, and Johnny Be Good. Johnny boy.
Okay, number three. What are we doing?
That's my question.
Who
What are we
knows?
doing?
Who knows? Like what we're doing here right now. But I guess we talked about going over Joscha Bach stuff.
Well, I'm actually enjoying this chair. You know, it's hard to find a good, strong wooden chair. Usually chairs you sink in or they're just shitty. This feels nice and firm. I do appreciate the chair.
That chair is basically a rock, yeah.
That's great.
It's not too bad. Good support.
So who's Joscha Bach? Joscha Bach.
So I guess Joscha Bach is a decent topic for today. Because he's kind of a counter to Hoffman, even though they're kind of saying the same thing. In a lot of ways.
Do you want to really recap real fast what Hoffman was talking about for people who didn't hear the last episode?
So I guess Hoffman tried to use evolutionary game theory simulations to show that if you're good at evolution, if you're good at acquiring fitness points, fitness payoffs, you're moving in a direction away from an objective reality.
And then on a larger level, he was saying that I guess like the physical world isn't necessarily the fundamental. It isn't fundamental, but it's more so consciousnesses, right?
Yeah. So Joscha Bach kind of says the same thing in a different way. You know, he calls it a dream.
Okay.
And so he's a big AI guy, and I'll make sure to put some of his interviews in the description.
Yeah, I noticed he's more of a computer scientist type.
Yeah, way more kind of conceptual AI. And so one big difference is Joscha Bach builds these really sophisticated AI architectures, and he believes that we can learn about our own brain by building out new AI architectures. And
I believe he said in order to understand ourselves, we have to understand the AI.
I wouldn't be surprised if he said something like that. Hoffman used like Gödel's theorem to.
Why do you think that is, though?
Why he believes that, or why he would think that that's the case?
Yeah. So like, is he trying to say that we are like computers, or?
Shit.
Hope you got insurance.
I guess he does feel that way. I mean, I remember him saying he thinks that consciousness is simple.
Okay.
He definitely seems to think that if we make an AI complex enough, it can be self-aware.
Gotcha. Okay. So eventually AIs will become self-aware.
Yeah. Which is like anyway similar to Hoffman. Hoffman just describes it more of like opening a window to an underlying existing consciousness field. Joscha Bach describes it more like a very measured approach. So Hoffman uses Gödel's theorem to say that there's always room for something outside of any scientific theory framework. And you know, by that logic, you can say, well, our 3D space-time, there's something outside of it that we don't know about, and so we can at least say that. We can at least say that there's something outside of it and we don't know. So Joscha Bach doesn't necessarily think that, from what I remember, I've been watching a few interviews, he doesn't necessarily think that Gödel was correct in that systems have these outside truths. He actually thinks that that's evidence for something that is actually not if it's not measurable to him, it's not quite deserved to be called a reality.
Truth. Yeah, reality.
So he thinks that you have to be able to reconstruct something in order to like be confident in saying that it's a actual thing. And he's part of this camp of like the real numbers aren't real, which I've been hearing, which is an interesting thought. Which I need to continue chewing on because it's a little loopy.
Yeah, it's not kind of loopy. The real numbers are not real.
Yeah.
So what are they?
I guess Joscha Bach was saying they're functions.
They're functions.
What numbers are functions, and you can apply the function, and that's when it's real, is when you're applying it.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the number itself,
it's just
a symbol. Yeah, a symbol and a concept, and I guess like so in that regard, he doesn't think that there's any sort of inaccessible space. He just thinks that we don't know enough. Gotcha. And eventually we'll just it's possible to get there. I mean, but they're similar anyway, because that also doesn't really give you any information about like the limit, which is what Hoffman's sort of trying to approach. Is like, is there actually going to ever be a time when we get to a place where we're like, oh, we know it.
Right.
But Joscha Bach doesn't seem to like thinking that way. He's very like, we'll wake up a conscious AI once it's complex enough, it seems.
Yeah, it seems to me like one believes the horizon is there and it's attainable, while Hoffman is more so you can see the horizon, but you can never get there.
Yeah, well, because even if you did, then there's a new horizon.
Exactly. It's really it's like a mirage. The closer you get, it's gone.
Yeah. Which, like I said, I feel like they're saying really similar things. Joscha Bach calls it a dream. He calls that inaccessible space. He calls that physical reality, which we don't know about. Mm-hmm. And then we're living in this dream that consciousness does for itself.
Gotcha. Okay.
And he boils down consciousness to the story that we tell ourselves, which is fair enough. It still mirrors Hoffman in many ways, in that the self-simulation is the story. Yeah. You're telling the story to yourself. You're self-simulating a world.
Yeah, Hoffman just seems to put more emphasis on consciousness.
Yeah. So his underlying like consciousness web space, I guess Joscha Bach doesn't approach it that way so much. He comes off as more realist. But it still seems to me that he glosses over the question of when does the self-awareness spark.
Yeah.
You just say eventually we're going to get complex enough. So that's only just like a matter of just seeing what time eventually has the final say in that.
I mean, it's kind of like the conversation behind, the evolution of living things. At one point, did you have your first living thing? Like, how did we go from RNA to multicellular organisms? At what point did this become that? And where's that spark of life?
Yeah. I guess I just put so much emphasis in embodiment. And he was one interview he was talking mad shit about the embodiment idea, because there's sort of a camp, I think, in AI that says, well, to be self-aware you need an embodiment because the self-awareness has to be interwoven with a sensory modality. And that sensory modality is whatever you're embodied in. And so he kind of like shit on that. And he was talking about the one guy that made the Roomba. He was like, this guy was really, really like, far ahead in his field, and he had all these great ideas. And he really took the torch of the AI has to be embodied in order to be self-aware. And at the end of it all, he got the Roomba and he quit.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he doesn't. I guess he doesn't feel so strongly about the embodiment, but I just when we were talking about like the cell swarm intelligence and memory across organs, it just seems to me a lot that our notion of self-awareness does seem to be deeply entwined with the body. But that's a tough question.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yeah.
I was listening to Lex today, and this guy he had on, he made this really interesting point about the memory across different systems and the way that it's written into the system is through like interrelation. And so I remember when we were talking about how like it seems like interrelation is very connected to like this like real. Part of that is kind of because interrelation exists almost at every scale. Every scale has like one thing in common, and that's that it's a complex web of interrelations between whatever is constituting that scale. And we were wondering, how can things have memory? Well, kind of hit me in that moment. I was like, oh, it's through the interrelation web that memories are written.
Through the interrelation web. That kind of reminds me of a Kurt Vonnegut book called Cat's Cradle.
I didn't read that one.
And the whole premises behind that is that everyone in the world is connected by some sort of interrelational web. He calls, I think, the Cat's Cradle. Except these people may not be related to you, may not have anything to do with you. You could be completely like separated in many different ways, but for some reason your lives are connected in some way, and your lives will affect each other.
Yeah. So I mean, our collective memory, which we call history, obviously is written into our interrelations.
Oh yeah.
Our individual memory seems to be written into the interrelations of our organs. And there's a pretty clear route to take there. We could take it as far down as,
No, that makes sense. Like we were saying how, your memories might be tied to a certain sense or a certain feeling you had. Like you might really remember something if you had a really bad stomach ache. Like I really remember that day. Like I felt like shit. Like these kind of things really help deepen our memories.
Yeah, and I mean, you carry a lot of memories that you don't know about.
That is true. That is true. Sometimes you don't realize, like, I was listening to, I grew up listening to ABBA, Santana, Bob Marley. That's like the first music I remember hearing as a kid, whatever my parents were playing or my brother was playing. So one day I was listening to ABBA in Spanish, because they would listen to ABBA in Spanish. And like some of these songs, like I hadn't heard, like it sounds so familiar, but like this song sounds so familiar. So my mom died years ago, like a decade ago. And I was just sitting in the car. I was driving my stepmom somewhere, and I put this song on. And for some reason, the context of being in the car with my stepmother and playing this particular song drove me to tears. And I couldn't explain why. I didn't really remember this song. I don't remember it. But for some reason, the situation of being out with my mother, out with my former mother and now my newer mother, it just kicked this memory into me, and it just was uncontrollable. Like emotions just rushed through me for like an hour. And it's so weird. It's exactly what you said. We carry memories that we don't even know.
Yeah, I had a really funny experience that's just the most high thought. But I remember one time tripping, and I was with my partner, and we were like together in bed, and I felt like a shiver go through her. And I almost thought about this idea that certain historical episodes and like the entire genetic history of her family are like almost possibly written into her own nervous system. Like the brief trauma of some sort of war. And almost like a general off in the distance being like, yeah, like, remember this, motherfuckers. You know, like some general from hundreds of years ago sending me a message like, yeah, I was fucking here in this genetic lineage.
And it embodies a shiver.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Like, it just makes... How far back does a shiver go, you know? Is it your shiver? Don't we share the shiver with everything that came before us? Is it the same shiver, or are they new shivers?
I mean, do we have the same fears? Do we have the same ideas, the same hopes, concerns?
Yeah, I mean, there's the really like beaten horse of all the anxieties of predators being transferred onto the anxieties of modern society, awkwardly and not quite right. So it expresses itself all awkwardly, like today's psycho. You know how modern society is sort of like plagued by anxieties that
become neuroticism.
Yeah, that presumably maybe are sort of new.
Yeah.
Because like all the anxieties of like being out in the wild, you know, now kind of have to transfer themselves onto whatever you're going through at work.
And I think family also plays a big role in that.
And family, yeah.
Family can drive you crazy. Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like for many millennia, like a lot of people would just go to war. You know, whether it's intertribal warfare or whatever. And then now we don't really have war on that scale anymore. There's still war in the world, but for the most part, we're all in our homes going to work. Like,
yeah,
those people who still have that inner like war spirit, like how do they take it out? In anger? You know, people who just are often mad at stuff or start fights for no reason.
Yeah, well, sports, I guess. Yeah,
sports. Yeah, it's interesting.
But see, that's the part of Joscha's model that I just have a hard time feeling is smooth enough for me to really grok. Is there so much focus on the brain that I guess I'm still in that embodiment camp. The body is just so tightly woven, it seems, the whole thing. Doesn't seem to me like the brain simply being complex enough is going to do the thing, is going to make the spark, like a central neural net. Then again, I mean, a neural net can incorporate like sensory inputs and stuff, so.
I think another thing he mentioned was that the brain is so old that most of our brain is our primal brain, if you want to call it that. It's more based on sensory perception and, you know, balance and all of that, while our higher order thinking, or what makes us human or whatever, is really just like the outer part. Like your prefrontal cortex and all that.
At the same time, you know, if you have an AI that you can communicate with, I guess you can kind of say that it'll always be embodied anyway. Even if the embodiment is just a computer case. If you're communicating with it, it does have a sensory input, which is the input from you.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it could be a collection of computers and through some sort of network. That could be an embodiment. Or just a tower, that can be an embodiment.
I remember they were talking about the most recent high-level AI. What is it, GPT-3?
Mm-hmm.
And how anything over 2 or 3 symbols, when it's trying to like to work with more than two symbols, it just breaks down. It can't really handle, like it can't really make coherent sentences, and that's something that we're great at. We're great at handling many different variables, and looking through the different possibilities and making coherent sense. Like that's something the brain does that AI definitely can't do, not yet at least.
Yeah. Joscha Bach just seems to really
Driving is a great example. Like AI cars are getting better and better, but there's a lot of shit that they still can't do that humans can do while they're still on their fucking phone.
You know what Joscha Bach does is I feel like he uses Newton's flaming laser sword very, very liberally. And so Newton's flaming laser sword is I forget what you call it. It's kind of like a philosophical tool.
Like an Occam's razor?
Yeah, whereas Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation is probably the most correct one.
Mm-hmm.
Newton's flaming laser sword says that if you can't prove something true or not, then there's no point in even discussing it.
Gotcha.
So I think Joscha Bach is very Newton's flaming laser sword about things. Like he's not going to start wondering about some like vast unknown. He's just going to say, if you can construct it, it's real. I mean, yeah, so I remember him talking about his childhood experiences looking at a computer and thinking, oh, this will replicate anything I put into it. So I can recreate anything that I can think of, including reality, if I know it to enough detail. That's his sort of approach to computers.
That makes sense.
And, okay, so that's an interesting notion, right? It's like if you can recreate reality, if you knew it to enough detail. I think we're going to have to just make this also Wolfram episode, because I want to try to use Wolfram's model to explain my side here, even though it would be probably butchering all of these ideas. But
we'll talk more about Wolfram. You were mentioning it last time.
So have you ever heard of John Conway's Game of Life?
No.
John Conway's Game of Life
I know
is
John Connor. Dun.
That's a funny relation there, because I don't think they're so far off conceptually. John Conway was a mathematician. He developed this he called it the Game of Life, where at its most simple iteration you can have sort of like a chessboard of white and black squares, or it'll all be one color. The rules are up to you. Let's say you start with all one color and you have some random black squares, and then you assign a rule to that chessboard. Like you say, if there's 3 whites and 1 black, you can grow in a direction or multiply or whatever. And if you assign a rule like that to the whole chessboard, and then you kind of hit go, it'll evolve across time. It'll evolve over time, the chessboard, according to that rule you set.
Gotcha.
And if you set these rules in certain ways, you actually get these, if your chessboard is big enough, things are arranged, then the rule is right, things actually will evolve over time. First of all, they might evolve forever. And you'll never be able to predict how it evolves. And then if things are just right, it can actually evolve and have very definable characteristics. Like there's some, if you just use squares, you'll get some things that they call like flyers or gliders, and it looks like a little boomerang, and it'll like zip around until the rule kind of just eventually it will either zip around forever or it'll die out according to what parameters you have set there. And so Wolfram, he's a math guy as well. He created the Wolfram Alpha website that a lot of college students use. and kind of building on this John Conway's Game of Life thing, he has done a lot of work in computation theory, information theory, complexity theory. And, so he found that when you're considering systems like this that have simple rules, they can be very simple rules, but if you start with right conditions, those simple rules actually will give a system the ability to evolve maybe infinitely and to get incredibly complex. And, he found that that's largely how a lot of like large complex systems work. Like, when you think about nature and the weather and galaxies and space and stuff, his sort of like theory of everything that he's working on is trying to see if he can apply those ideas of starting with just a simple rule and then letting that evolve over countless iterations to give you a very complex superstructure.
In other words, you can predict the outcome is predictable from the beginning conditions, whatever rules are set.
So that actually is a big part of what he found, was that when you set rules, what actually happens is you don't know, you can't predict anything.
Oh, okay.
And so he established these limits on computation, where he was like, everything in the universe is sort of updating at the same time. And so you as an observer can't know every update. You're only getting the updates in your sort of little line of observation, because the rest of the universe, so there's two big terms, and I always want to try my best to avoid too many crazy terms, but they're really important in his framework. The first one being computational irreducibility, which is just that, which is that you actually can't predict. You can't take a system like this and try and know what's going to happen at the end. You can only let it go forever and observe it as it's going. And the other term is causal invariance. So causal invariance meaning not different, and causal meaning cause and effect. And what happens in these huge superstructures of updating events, of the causal timeline of things happening everywhere.
Gotcha.
Causal invariance, when you're looking at a structure like this, is an inevitability of these structures he's found, where it says that when you're looking at timelines of causality, things separate and they come back. And, I'm probably going to need a minute to try to weave that into like understandable terms here. But going back to computational irreducibility.
So there is a pattern then.
That's exactly it, and that's the part that's very funny and weird, because you look at nature and you kind of see these, you can call them a fractal or just like sort of an archetype or something. You see shapes like spirals, that like repeat themselves, and
the golden number or whatever.
Yeah, something like that. Those things, besides having possibly something to do with like the rule of how the updating events are updating themselves, there are also things that, like, within the causal network, when you see the same thing over and over, it's like sort of like possibly that it's this causal invariance thing, because it's like those updating events, certain things are repeated and then certain things converge again.
Yeah.
So his big project is attempting, sort of in a fun and tongue-in-cheek way, it's open to the public, is he sort of has this universe farm going on. And what it is that, like, everyone is free to sort of make up your own rules for, I guess, what you would consider to be the most indivisible, like, quantized unit of the universe and what it does, and like try to think of what the rule is. And if you go online, it's called Wolfram's Physics Project. You can see a bunch of these example, like, baby universes, sort of, from these rules, which the goal is to find the rule that our universe may be following, that, you know, from its inception has led to this. But the thing is, like, that indivisible quantized unit is, like, so small that it's, you know, first of all, like, finding a needle in a galaxy of haystacks.
So if you were to, like, let's say whatever rules you decide to set for this one universe or whatever, and then you ran that 100 times, you're not always going to get the same result, right?
They'll be probably a little bit different, but causally and variantly eventually converge. Right? So if you ran it 100 different times for 1,000,000 iterations, they'll all probably be a little bit different, because there will be, like, points where maybe they did something a little different, but then at some point maybe they'll pinch into the same thing again.
So that makes me think of multiple universes. So, you know, like, they're all very similar. There's just one little difference here, one little difference there.
Yeah. So that was exactly the next thing that I was going to segue into. His view on the multiverse thing is sort of more like, he introduced the idea of new spaces. So you have 3D space-time. And in 3D space-time, time is the thing that you measure by moving through causal events. And those causal events create update events across the entire universe, which is the time within 3D space-time. But those causal events are all branches from the quantum states. So beyond 3D space-time, you also have what he calls branchial space, which is the branching of every possible event that could have happened. And that's sort of when you think about quantum physics and the wave function of probability, which includes all these possible events, and then each event which led to the event before it has an infinite amount of possible events it could have done. So branchial space, he accounts for all of that, and he sees it more, it seems, kind of like a braided knot, where things aren't necessarily, you know, multiverses aren't being created moment by moment, but it's kind of like the braided knot contains within itself all those events, but as observers we're moving through a particular line of that.
Gotcha. Okay, I see. It's kind of like how our sun is floating through space. it's just following one path along many possible different paths. And
yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, kind of, because it's like each moment has an infinite amount of different possible ways you could take it, and then every moment following that has an infinite amount of possible ways you could take it. So it's like the branchial space gets way, way crazier right off the bat, from causal space, 3D space-time. But you still have causal invariance that reflects even from the branchial space and the 3D space-time, and that causal invariance sort of has to do with how things like space-time become I forget the word they use, but how it like sort of appears, because 3D space-time is sort of interwoven with these larger events in branchial space, and through causal invariance, they're actually related. Conceptually speaking, because the branchial space, it's not at a point right now where they're definitely he's very excited about a lot of interesting discoveries he's making. Like it seems that he's been able to sort of bridge many different fields of math that have sort of existed as islands, because like there's all this crazy math being developed, but like they're kind of existing in their own thing. They're all over the place. He is trying to like sort of bridge all these together using this big web of this like sort of very primary, he calls them hypergraphs. So it's far from like a real world application, but he's definitely making progress in the sense of doing math and stuff like that. But the implications, simply speaking, of this causal invariance through branchial space and 3D space-time is that the events in 3D space-time are interlinked with these things in branchial space that are presumably sort of like happening at this different scale. I don't even know if you can say a scale, right? Because scale refers to a 3D concept of size. Branchial space refers to this sort of like
multi-dimensional.
Yeah, multi-dimensional thing. So you've got branchial space, which is pretty standard. I mean, we all know about multiverse. We all know about the wave function probability of branching paths of possibility and stuff like that.
Yeah, we all saw DBZ.
So, but then he sort of takes it one step further, and beyond branchial space, he's looking at this object that he calls rulal space, because branchial space is still, let's say, governed by that basic set of rules, which are the physical laws for the universe that you're looking at. But the universe can have different rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so beyond branchial space, there's a rulal space, which is the set of not just all the things in space-time that are causally happening to one another by your observational standpoint, and then not just every possible thing that could occur across every possible moment, but then also every possible set of rules that could allow for every possible possibility within a universe. And in that rulal space, that's where he made the wild claim, not claim, but possibility that I just loved, and it harkens sort of to Hoffman, is that he was like, causal invariance should still apply up into rulal space, as does computational irreducibility, but thinking that causal invariance actually still crawls up that far up, rulal space, because it's theoretically sort of like this braid of all of the things interlocked into one another within different rulal paths in the rulal space, there's different physical manifestations of self-awareness, and those physical manifestations of self-awareness are in some ways, or should be theoretically, interwoven with our own experience in indirect ways. And so through this weird causal invariance and the rulal space, he was thinking about, like, he was like, and this is what he said, he was like, I used to think that if we ever found like any extraterrestrials or aliens, like, I was pretty confident that at least they'd have the same physics as us. And he's like, but I don't think that anymore. They don't need the same physics as us. They can just exist in a different path in the rulal space, which will then dictate their branchial space. And that sort of leads to their sensory modality, which theoretically is interwoven with our own sensory modality through causal invariance in ways that we'll just not have access to.
So could you give examples of some of these rules that you could possibly have that would be at the start? Like, what kind of rules are we talking about?
John Conway's game of life is the simplest way to look at it. Like, you have a white square surrounded by black squares, or like maybe there's a couple white squares touching the perimeter. And so you sort of just say, evolve the system forward in this way if this is available. So, when you're thinking about like the universe, the laws of physics are kind of like those rules, is to say, if you have this much mass, it's going to now be sort of correlated with a certain amount of a force, gravity force or an electrical force. But if you're just looking at a simple computational like system evolving, the rules could be as simple as like you can have ups and downs, and if there's one up with two downs next to it, it becomes a down. And if there's three downs in a row, two of them become two ups. And then you just let that evolve. Another example is fractals. Fractals are just that. They're just simple rules recursively executing onto themselves, and they can just keep going infinitely.
Gotcha.
So just sort of to suggest that fractals are sort of this like primitive universe situation. Which that might be simplistic. It might be simplistic to say that the universe can be boiled down to a simple rule, at its most basic, and let it just branch out. But I think it's a pretty beautiful notion, because the idea of computational irreducibility puts a limit on how much you can know. And I like that, because it says that like you'll just be limited to your observation as to just how much update information you can get. And it's just like, when we look at stars, like if we look at stars, that light's coming from millions of years ago. Like we can't have the power to like know the updating events everywhere. It's like we're so constrained by our scale, by our place in our space, branchial,
By the
rulal.
speed of light, first of all.
Right. That's kind of a rule.
Exactly.
In this universe, is that once you get to that speed, something happens. When you look at the website, like they can be like very like simple arbitrary things, and by no means I feel like any of these like baby universes are gonna like look like ours, but at the same time, it's tough because the amount of iterations you have to go through is mind-boggling, probably.
That's why we have computers.
Even computers, even with powerful computers, you probably have to iterate over something for like billions, trillions, Googles of times before it might be like something where we'll sort of maybe be like, hey, that looks like something that actually might be useful to teach us something. It might take so many iterations that we just won't know until we do that many iterations. And it's like, which rule do we think is worth it to do that many iterations?
So then that makes me wonder if it's not so much the fact that you have to wait so much time, but it's just a method that's crude, and there's a better method to get the results you're looking for.
So I think intuitively that is definitely like an initial thought that I think anybody would have, but specifically computational irreducibility just says that there is no method when it comes to like a system that is updating itself across a vast number of like update nodes, it kind of feels like there should be a way to like be able to predict what's going to happen, because our physics is like that. Like we can like do a thing, but when it comes to this like hyper complex computational like evolution of systems, like that is like their claim, is that these systems are beyond being able to grasp, because sort of like if you were to grasp it, you're affecting the system, and you have to let the system have the freedom to escape your grasp in order for it to do what it wants to do properly. Because sort of by like wrapping your head around it, you're actually limiting it. You're probably going to force it into some sort of limit so that you can understand it. And he was talking about search engines in that way. I heard him talking about to like Congress in one video, and Congress wanted to know, like, you know, they wanted to have more transparency when it comes to like Google's search engine, search algorithm. And so Wolfram was telling them, he's like, you know, the problem with that is that the search algorithm, that AI is doing more than we know what it's doing. And if we try to actually look at it and make it understandable to us, it's not going to actually do what we want it to do, which is not going to do the interesting thing that we like that it's doing. And so his solution to transparency when it comes to searches going forward is, instead of trying to get the search engine to like be transparent and like have them change their code to have certain things, rules put on the search engine algorithm, you just have these third party like filters that like take their results and then filter those based on how you want it. But like, so that's the whole claim, is that you can't predict the system. The system can only be allowed to evolve, and you can sort of observe it and see where it goes.
Interesting.
So I thought that was worth explaining for Joscha.
That definitely sounds like it would lead to an AI becoming consciousness, because like an AI is, you know, it's, you know, you set the rules of how this thing will react to whatever the input is, and we just let it go. Eventually, it does its own thing. Might become consciousness. You know, it might become conscious, rather.
Yeah, that I've been sort of wondering this lately, in that, you know, I wonder if like, exactly, like we have an AI, we allow it to just evolve and become incredibly complex, to where like it almost seems like maybe it's actually self-aware,
And then it kills us all. You know.
It kind of almost seems to me that like, I feel like there's sort of like this limit on like us just not knowing, because once we know, like if we're like, oh, it might be conscious, and then we like figure out what it's actually doing, it's like, oh, it's actually not conscious, we figured it out. It's like, if we go in and figure it out, I almost feel like it's taking away that possibility of it actually being self-aware, and we'll never actually know, because we won't know if it just requires a little bit more sort of like computational power to figure out what the trick is. We'll just be presented with an AI complex enough that we just are like, oh, we have no idea how you're doing that.
Well, then that means we'll just never know.
Right. Yeah, then that's what I'm saying. Is like, are we sort of cursed to just never know until we find out and effectively kill the AI?
But how will we know?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is the ones that we do sort of like investigate and then figure out what it is that the little trick they're doing, and then we're like, oh no, it's not self-aware, it's just doing this.
Mm.
It's like we'll never know until we do that, and then we're effectively killing it until one is just so complex that we just can't figure it out. But that doesn't tell us whether it's actually self-aware.
Yeah, that's true.
We're just not going to know, which is weird.
Sounds like a paradox.
Yeah. Michael Levin, the bioengineer guy that made the Xenobots, kind of said something like that too, because he's just like, it's going to be much harder going forward to tell what exactly is self-aware. What if you're looking at a thing, because now robots are going to be made of biological parts. You know, you're not going to be sure whether you're looking at something that's alive or something that's not alive, or an animal or not an animal. Like, you're not even going to know. Along with like how we don't know if AI is even self-aware, it just kind of seems like we're probably going to need to just develop a hierarchy of at the end of it all not knowing, but I guess semblance of self-awareness and or biologicalness.
And who will define it? Is it the scientific community defining it?
That'll be a fun one.
Is it going to be political institutions defining it?
Who is going to define the lines between self-awareness and biology?
It's a great question. Makes me wonder about your cat. Is that really a cat, or?
Yeah, it's a little flea bag.
I used to live with fleas. It's the worst.
Yeah.
Went through that for like about half a year.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's the worst.
Yeah, when I first found him, he was covered in fleas, and the place I was living at the time got infested, and I got out of there.
I still live there. But the drugs do the trick.
So that's what makes me skeptical about Joscha Bach is, even though I'm using this highly unfounded, it's not barely even scientific, but like more like computationally conceptual framework of branchial space and radial space and causal invariance. It makes me skeptical of Joscha Bach, because I think the notion of rebuilding such complex structures as the ones that give rise to self-awareness, I think they're interwoven with larger structures in spaces that we don't have access to. And I think that is a sort of different study than the study that's, I feel like, being attempted right now towards AI and stuff like that. I mean, when it comes to general intelligence, because I think, you can have useful algorithms, but...
Yeah, I think it's two different things. I mean, because how would you apply AI to what you're talking about? You really wouldn't be able to. So there's a lot of different questions in the universe and a lot of different ways of approaching it. He's just going more with, like you said, if it's not provable, or if it doesn't render some sort of truth, then what's the point of even thinking about it?
Right.
He's just trying to filter through, like the possible things. Let other people think about that stuff. I'm going to focus on this.
Yeah. He's building, for sure.
Yeah.
He is building. It's like where Hoffman is sort of probing. He is building, these AI architectures. And then Wolfram's proposing. Wolfram's proposing very, very complicated, far-reaching notions. I mean, probably the closest thing maybe to the real, the real space being this nested, dimensional Russian doll of interwoven causal events, and interwoven sort of like harmonies across the nested Russian dolls. Harmony or...
I like harmony.
Harmony is many chords sort of like like a chord. A chord is harmony, right? And then what's it? Oh, melody. So yeah, harmony. Because causal invariance to me sort of speaks to harmony. The way that, exactly, like a chord.
Yeah.
Those are all different frequencies, but they sort of meet in this chord as a one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, music is just the perfect analogy for any of this.
Yeah. I mean, all you really need is two notes for a chord. Yeah, they're related to each other on 3/2 or 5/4. You know, it's all mathematical, and how these chords, for some reason, why they sound pleasing. These intervals, they call it.
Yeah, no, but it makes me giddy to hear somebody like Wolfram, who's, he's a real deal hardcore science physicist guy, talk about the possibility that, like, we're swimming through alien intelligences. Like, alien intelligences, for all we know, are the foundation of our physical world.
But if all these numbers and everything are just tools or just functions, if they don't really mean anything unless you like attach a meaning to them, is he just swimming in his own like masterful creation of nonsense?
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing tangible about it.
That's beautiful. It sounds
There's
awesome.
nothing
But
tangible.
is it really attached to anything real in the world?
There's nothing tangible about it, but tangible is the thing that sort of like we've established is sort of the trick. The tangible. The tangible is sort of like it's fun. It's, it's sensory. It's sensual. It's right, it gets inside you. But, if we establish that the sensory is the big trick, then, at least there's a foundation for the conceptual proposal of branchial space, Rolial space, and the infinite alien intelligences allowed within the causally invariant braid of causality.
Certainly a nice way to explain aliens.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and I mean the DMT connection is just too obvious.
Do you have any closing thoughts as we come up on the hour?
Okay, so that was a soft hour. Joscha Bach and Wolfram. It's cool that we went over those two. We talked about making some episodes about maybe some historical stuff, so we can give that a try. But I want to continue, following all these ideas and seeing what new stuff comes up and how it relates to all the other different ones. So, I'm glad we gave Joscha Bach his moment, because we need, I think he's the most grounded in the provable reality, and that's important to maintain.
I think I had some notes, because I was taking notes. Some stuff I wanted to mention.
That's important to maintain while I'm taking us on this Wolfram Rolial space infinite intelligence swarm.
Because, thoughts are so ephemeral. Like, you're listening to something, you'll think of something, and then you, like, stop thinking about it because you want to keep listening or paying attention.
Yeah.
And that thought is gone. You got to write it down.
It's gone. Was it just a visitor?
Was it just a visitor?
Was it just a visitor from a different path in Rolial space?
So I found interesting how he was talking about, like, this idea of, like, software within software. Like, kind of in a way how, like, we're still in this virtual reality, but it's kind of like you're wearing a VR headset, like you're experiencing this other world, but it's not the real. It's just this reality. So I think that's how he was trying to explain how, not him necessarily. Maybe they're talking about different ideas, but just how this may just be this dream, like you were talking about.
Yeah, Joscha Bach calls it a dream, and it's the story that we're telling ourselves. It's our consciousness, the story. So I don't think he even believes in consciousness. He just our story convinces us, right, that we're. But I guess my optimism wants to believe that I'm threaded across every state of being.
And then just to go back earlier to yesterday's last episode with how we were talking about space time being really like localized to the person. It kind of made me think of space time in a way of being decentralized. Like we're kind of our own little local computer host, but that we still operate on a shared protocol. Like all these computers are local hosts, but they all understand the language of Wi-Fi, so they can connect to each other. So, that shared protocol may be how our realities sync up.
That's actually, I really think, exactly how Wolfram described time, and the reason that time slows down with high gravity or as you approach light speed, because the faster you get, the slower time goes for you. Like that whole thought experiment where if one astronaut, you have twins and one astronaut gets in a rocket ship and orbits the Earth at faster than light. Yeah. He comes back to the Earth a little younger because time went slower for him. So that's exactly how Wolfram put it, is that we're sort of these individual computers performing computations, and the computations of movement and time are actually shared energy. They share that like energy to evolve in the system. So if you go faster and faster, you're taking away
energy from time.
Yeah, from how much I'm putting quotes around energy because it's not the energy that is, heat, but in this weird 3D space-time fabric, whatever's allocated to updating your time, the faster you move, the less of that's being allocated, so you're having less time actually go by because you're going so fucking fast. So that's a weird correlation there, but it is explained rather elegantly by Wolfram's model, because what it's saying is that these update events in causal space, causal time, they're if you have so much of time and you have so much of speed, if you start increasing the speed, you're going to lose out on the time. And that has to do with that whatever computational rule or power is going on at that.
Well, that's Einstein right there.
Oh, definitely, and that's what he's trying to do, is because anybody that's proposing a sort of like more fundamental theory has to rebuild what's already there.
Right.
So that's absolutely him being able to show that his model can be used for relativity.
He's showing off.
Is a serious flex. Is a serious flex.
But yeah, no. So it's interesting that our theory of particles, our quantum mechanics may just be that shared protocol between our individual island universes, my space time and your space time. Even though they're local, they still have to communicate on some level in order to both agree that is a hard surface that we can sit on.
Yeah, there's a couple other mind-blowing, like he was talking about fractional dimensions. There's the possibility that there might be 3.5 dimensional space, 3.1 dimensional space. And he's trying to come up with ways to measure that sort of thing. I love when he proposes crazy shit, because he is just, on such a crazy level. And he says certain things, he says them as a joke, because he's kind of like, I've got nothing to back this. But he's starting to believe that particles may actually just be tiny black holes. Probably in the sense that they're sort of like dense enough in energy that they might collapse in on themselves, but for all intents and purposes, they don't behave like a big black hole. They behave like what a tiny black hole would behave like with that energy. And like a proton has a ton of energy. That's the atom bomb. So the idea being, like, if you're able to pack all that energy into that tiny bit of space, what you're going to end up with is what would look like a proton, but it's actually a tiny black hole.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. made up of the quirks or whatever, and it's harder and harder to probe into them. But that's definitely a out there thing. But
All right.
But I'm gonna go deeper into what he's up to lately and do an update on that. But that was basically the intro to Wolfram's thing, and I'm always gonna do my best to keep a Joscha Bach perspective on things too.
Yeah, I definitely want to check him out a little more.
I'll put some interviews with Joscha, and I'll put some links up to Wolfram stuff.
I'll see if there's anything I could read from him, because it'll be a little easier to follow.
Wolfram?
No,
Joscha?
Joscha, yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at his book, Psi, Principles of Synthetic Intelligence.
Principles of Synthetic Intelligence.
Yeah. I don't know if I buy it, but it sounds quite complicated and impressive.
Any closing thoughts? Anything you want to leave the audience with?
No, I mean, I don't know. I got nothing. We'll give this history idea a try and see if we can come up with any interesting history niches that we can bring to the audience and see how that goes. So look out for that.
And I hope you guys have a good Eyes of March in the next couple of days. Beware of any knives and friends who might stab you in the back.
Man, I don't know anything about that.
Makes it all the much easier.
Duh.
All right, good night.
Peace out.